Now we do our usual vocalization. Unique New York.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 75 of the Solosaurus podcast. I'm Michael Eckenfels.
I'm Martin Gonzalez.
Yeah, and I'm David Thompson.
And today, as you can tell, we have a guest on the show, David Thompson, acclaimed wargame designer. According to your profile on Board Game Geek, your designs include Undaunted Normandy, Undaunted North Africa, War Chest, and the Nobility Expansion, Orc Olympics, Armageddon, Pavlov's House, Castle Itter, Europe Divided, and For What Remains. And Martin, how did you dig this guy up? I mean, he's not done anything, geez. I'm kidding. I'm completely kidding, of course. Your latest design for DVG that we recently reviewed on this very podcast by Stealth and C. So, David, welcome to the show, and please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's awesome to be here. As you guys know, I dig your podcast. I am a consumer of podcasts, and so obviously two things I'm very passionate about is solo games and war games. So glad to see you guys have been doing a little bit of war game coverage lately. That's something very close to my heart. So yeah, just thanks for having me.
No problem. You're welcome. And we're working on Martin to turn him into one.
I know he's going to be a war gamer.
So much pressure.
This podcast is brought to you by Stone Valley Games, your friendly, distant game store. Check them out at stonevalleygames.com. It's a great shop because most of the games over there are great for solo players, and they're always adding new content to their storefront. It's very important to our hobby to support a small family-run solo-friendly game store.
So, hey, speaking of which, of Stone Valley Games, can I tell you guys a quick little story about them?
Absolutely.
So, I was listening to your podcast, and you mentioned Stone Valley, and I can't remember. I mean, obviously, you always mention them, but it was in the context of maybe them sending you a review copy, or I can't remember exactly what it was. But I went and checked them out, and I was stunned to see that they're in Huntsville, Alabama, which I lived in for like 12, 13 years.
Oh, wow.
They actually opened up shop after I moved away. I left in 2014. But yeah, very close to where I used to live. So I reached out to Eric, and we've chatted a few times. He's even sent out a couple of review copies of games that I've designed to people. So
Nice.
Anyway, he's super. I mean, I know you guys, people know this if they listen to your podcast. I don't need to tell anybody this. But man, super awesome guy. And I just wish that they were my friendly local game store. I wish they had been there in Huntsville when I lived there. So highly recommend them to everybody.
Thank you for sharing that, man. Yeah, Eric's awesome. I mean, I genuinely cannot stop talking about how great he is, and how he helps Michael and me out a lot of the time with he'll give us some advice about the pod every so often. He's like, far be it from me, but I would just make the suggestion, and all of his suggestions are amazing. So yeah, he's great.
Yep.
Yeah,
he definitely keeps us busy with review copies, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, and the stuff he stocks is amazing, right? Just fantastic. Oh, yeah. Like, I just have local game store envy, big time. Man, I would love to just be able to walk into a store that's stocked like that, and yeah.
Well, yeah, he definitely has his own point of view, and he is a gamer himself, and he's got a very wide spectrum of interests, and he's got a particular focus for solo gaming, and he writes a blog post for a lot of the games that he gets in stock, and they're well worth reading. They're not just ad copy. So yeah, no, he really pours his heart and soul into it. You can feel the passion.
All right, so let's get started asking the hard questions here, David. Not hard questions. They're going to be pretty easy. I'm sure you've done this.
It's going to be a very hard-hitting interview. I know what you were prepared for.
Digging up all the dirt.
Yeah. All the skeletons in your Stealth and C closet.
Yeah.
So tell us, David, how did you first get involved in game design?
Yeah, so that's like many people, right? Many game designers, the typical stories are like D&D and Magic the Gathering and stuff like that. And so I came from a Dungeons and Dragons background. That's what I grew up on. Started playing when I was a teenager. And then I basically stayed in that hobby until I was in my probably late 20s. So about the time I got married and started having kids, I just didn't have enough time to dedicate. I was always the dungeon master, right? And I was one of those that was making huge amounts of homebrewed material that no one ever encountered, right? But I just loved the creative process. But I didn't have enough time to dedicate to it anymore. And I was into things like tactical role playing video games like Final Fantasy Tactics, and I played a little bit of Blood Bowl and D&D. And so about that time, I started flirting with a board game design idea. And it's funny because I didn't even really know that board games existed, right? I knew, like I said, I knew Blood Bowl. And if you guys remember, do you guys know the Hero Clicks game?
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Right. Okay. So before Hero Clicks, there's a game called Mage Knight, not the board game, but the Clicks game that came before the board game. Right.
Oh wow. I didn't know
Yeah.
about that one.
Yep. Yeah. And so I knew that game. I knew Blood Bowl. So those are the things that was kind of informing this design of mine. And much later, that design would go on to become my game For What Remains. Right. But that we're talking like 15 years ago. And so I started researching board games, and so I fell into the hobby, right? And so as I was transitioning out of role playing games, I started playing and then designing board games, and so it was a weird sort of path to get there. But yeah,
Before we leave the topic of before we move on to the next question, I want to ask you: did you ever play Castle Amber?
I did not. No.
Oh,
Mm-mm.
okay.
No.
maybe a little before your time.
Yeah, I didn't really play. So the last system I think I played on, last video game system, was probably PlayStation, like the original
Mhm.
PlayStation. So yeah, I grew up on like Nintendo. Well, Commodore 64, Atari,
Yeah.
Nintendo, and then ended with PlayStation. It was a long gap before I eventually bought an Xbox, but that was just to do research for a game I designed. Right, so kind of strange.
David, what was your first board game purchase, and what was it about it that drew it to you, and what kind of an influence or impact did it have on you as a designer, as a gamer?
Yeah, yeah. So I read this question, and so one thing about me is I have an absolutely horrible memory, right? So I can kind of, I'll continue from where I left off with the last question. So, I, I was, like I said, I was into role playing games. I was starting to just discover this world of board games, and I did that through. If you guys know the Secret Cabal, do you guys know that podcast? Have you ever heard of them?
Yes.
Yes.
So their podcast, when they first came out, they had role playing game content, and that's how I found their podcast. And then through their podcast, that's how I learned about board games. And then I found Board Game Geek, and I stumbled upon a local guy who was running a game night, and so I asked him if I could come over. And I think we played. Maybe we played Star Wars X-Wing, right? I know that was one of the very first games I played when I went to my first game night. But I think the first game I bought was probably like Catan. I mean, not Carcassonne, maybe, because I knew that my wife might be interested. So I can't remember exactly, but it was something like Carcassonne or Seven Wonders or something. And then people like neighbors and stuff would come over every once in a while. We'd have like double dates where couple would come over and we'd play games. So it was a long like that didn't really influence my design. That would have probably been about a year or two later. I was still meeting up with that same group of guys that I would travel to, and they were sort of the alpha gamers, and they would introduce me to new games. And one of them introduced me to A Few Acres of Snow, and I often credit it for being one of the most sort of foundational experiences I had when it comes to game design. I think it still informs a lot of what I guess I find interesting in game design.
I got to put that one on my to play list for sure. I've never played that one. Michael, have you played A Few Acres of Snow?
I've heard of it, but I have not played it.
It's actually a French and Indian War game designed by Martin Wallace. Yeah, it's a fantastic game. But it's a deck build. So it has deck building as probably the primary mechanism, but it has a board. It has a lot of spatial elements, and if you think about that, If you just said, hey, a war game that combines deck building, right, with some spatial elements, it's the same sort of high level description as Undaunted. So it shouldn't take people, too much to kind of draw that lineage from Few Acres of Snow to Undaunted.
Before we ask the next question, I'm curious as to something you said. What year was that first game night of yours?
So I think 2012.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, 2011, 2012, something like then. Yeah.
You guys make me feel old. Martin, you just started what, 2017, you said?
I did, yeah. 2017 is when I started.
And I've been doing it since 1977 or so. That was the first year I bought one. Oh, boy. Okay. Well, that's all right.
It is interesting. I definitely got into, board gaming as a hobby and design, much later, right? So, my first published game was 2016. So I would have been like 36, 37 at the time.
Cool.
So, yeah.
Tell us what's your philosophy towards solo gaming in general and designing solo modes in particular. I mean, what brought you to that? I mean,
yeah, sure. Well, so it's interesting. I mean, for sure, when I'm thinking that now, we should proceed this with, let's talk about solo games versus solo modes of games, right? Because I think that's a really important distinction.
Yep.
When I'm designing solo, like if you look at my games, they fall into two camps. They're either solitaire specific designed games or a multiplayer game that I don't design a solo mode for. And so if we look at some of those, like, and I don't count like By Stealth and Sea and Pavlov's House, games that have like co-op or what are multiplayer options, but those are really solitaire games, right, at their heart. But then like Undaunted is going to have a solo mode come out this summer, right? And Sniper
Which I'm very
Elite.
excited about.
Yeah, I it's funny. I am too, but I didn't work on it, right? And so it might be surprising to people, but like, and I also did Sniper Elite, which is an adaptation of a video game. But again, it was a multiplayer hidden movement game that I didn't design the solo mode. And so I struggle, like this is just a weakness about me. I struggle when I design a multiplayer game trying to come up with what I think is an interesting solo mode for it. And so that goes back to the original. My philosophy towards solo gaming is I like a solitaire game to be built as a solitaire game from the ground up, right? Like going into it knowing this is the experience I'm trying to deliver. And usually that's because I oftentimes don't feel like the opponent side of it is an interesting experience to play, right? So, if you're playing something like Castle Itter, it's not really fun if you're the German just running straight ahead at a castle, right? Like there's not as nearly as many interesting decisions on that side. And occasionally you'll have a situation like, I designed a game called Soldiers in Postmen's Uniforms, where one side is the defenders of this Polish postman defending a post office. Well, the other side is really, really, really horrible people, right? SS officers or SS soldiers that wind up burning people alive. And I'm not going to put players in that position to play that role, right? I'm not interested in allowing that. So yeah, my philosophy is basically when it comes to solo, I want it to be a game where it's built around the solo experience from the ground up, and specifically trying to automate something that I think is probably a less interesting role to play.
So when we had a few episodes ago, we had Drake Villarreal, who's a solo designer, and he got to talking about like a trend in solo games or games with solo modes nowadays, where the solo player or the AI is very streamlined and essentially is just basically a deck of cards. And then if you want to know what the solo AI does on their turn, flip over the next card in the deck and then just follow whatever is printed on those cards, whether it's icons or whatever. And you see this in games like Dune Imperium follows this model, and Lost Ruins of Arnak. And if you go a little further back, like to last year, a couple of years ago, Star Wars Outer Rim, has a solo AI deck that kind of controls. All it has, it's more text driven. So I'm curious to see what are your thoughts about, like, there seems to be a trend toward, kind of the opposite of the automas of years gone past, and I'm thinking particularly of like Scythe, which to me it felt like you had to have a PhD to be able to understand, how the solo AI operates here. And I look at those the Atoma deck for Scythe, and it's like, oh, these icons, I don't know what's going on here. So anyway, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but really, it just seems to me that the trend is, and to me, I think it's a positive trend, but I want to get your thoughts on it. It's like, more streamlined, just easier, very little upkeep, just like flip over a card, do what it does, and then really, really trying to ensure that the solo player plays the multiplayer version of the game on their turn as much as possible.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I would absolutely. I'll be honest with you. I probably wouldn't play a solo game where it's an elaborate multi-step flow charted, solitaire system. I lose interest pretty quick. The dirty secret for me is, I don't play mini games, period, but I don't play a whole lot of solo games, especially, and a lot of that is just I don't have. I have this issue where attention span. I'll be in the middle of something and I'll get sidetracked and like, well, I should be working on something else. And so it needs to be very tight, compact. The resolution for the AI needs to be super quick.
I'm all about that. Michael?
Yeah, well, the next question is yours, but I can ask it if you'd like.
Oh, is it? Because I went off script and I asked another question that wasn't on the page, which I thought was okay.
Oh, that's perfectly fine.
All right, so I'll stick with it. So the next question on the script is, and Michael, you'll fix this all in post, right? This will be like a smooth conversation. You won't leave all this like embarrassing like DVD in there.
Of course not. I'd never do that to you.
Do that to me.
No.
Okay. David Thompson, what is one solo game that you wish you had designed, and why?
Yeah, that's. Well, I originally read this question when we first started talking about getting together, I don't know, like a month ago or something. And I was like, I don't know the answer to this question. But I recently had the opportunity to be on a chat with John Butterfield. So Martin, do you know John Butterfield?
Yes, in fact, I do own one of his games. I believe it's Dawn of the Dead, the zombie game that happens in a mall. I believe is a Butterfield game.
I haven't played that. I know him from like Ambush and D-Day at Omaha Beach and Space Corps. And so he, in my opinion, he's basically the father of solitaire wargaming, right? I don't know how you would argue. I don't know how you present anybody else. And so I think it probably would be D-Day at Omaha Beach, which I like as a game, but more just because I think it would be. I think it's just an awesome achievement for him. I think he's had a long legacy of amazing solo designs, and I think he's just kind of a special designer. And so just kind of in homage to him, I think that would be my choice.
So tell us, David, what's your favorite game design so far and why? It could be your game, it could be other games.
Yeah. Well, I'll pick two, and we chatted about this briefly beforehand, and so we said, all designers say, "Oh, I love all my children equally," and I will say that of my games, every one of them has a little something special or personal. But my favorite is War Chest because I play it almost every day with my kids, and they want to play it, right? And so, like, I just wouldn't trade that for anything in the world. So if that's the game of mine that they enjoy playing, then that'll be my favorite game. But as far as like favorite game design, I mean, I want to definitely mention A Few Acres of Snow, like I said before, for two reasons. First, it's a brilliant design, independent of anything else. But second, because I do think it has been such a big influence on me. So I would definitely mention it. And then, I mean, my sort of favorite game changes, but you have like everybody else, right? I have a handful of favorite games, and which is my current favorite can shift around. But I would just say, generically speaking, like if it is a 30-ish minute, 2-player, super tight, super tense game, it's going to be in my top handful. So games like 13 Days and Blitzkrieg and Watergate, those kinds of games are just brilliant.
It's funny when you mentioned 30 minutes, two player, super tight. What popped into my head was Watergate.
Yeah, yeah,
A
yeah, man.
really well designed game.
Oh,
I know that we're a solo podcast, but I've actually played that with my wife, who doesn't play board games. And one day, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, she said, "All right, choose a game and let's play it." And turned out to be Watergate, and we had a great time. Although in the end, I won as Nixon, so she didn't like that so much. But um, the other thing you mentioned that, and you've been posting these on the Solitaire War Games Facebook group recently. I've seen a couple where you have like an after action report with your kids. And I am very impressed by the level of analysis that they're bringing to, okay, so I was watching one on By Stealth and Sea, and I think it was your daughter who was saying, yeah, and I got over here and did this, and then I blew up this ship, this merchant ship. I'm like, this is awesome. Like, this is great. Like, I would watch this show. Just you doing an after action report with your kids. I don't really think there's a question in here. I just wanted to mention that because you reminded me of it. I think that's amazing.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, man. I tell you, I can't believe. So, my son is cool, but he's cool because he'll basically play anything with me. Right now, we've got Star Wars Legion set up, and he and I have played. We play a ton of Pitch Car right now, but he'll play anything. His favorite game is War Chess, but he wanted to play By Stealth and Sea right after the published version came out, and so we played through about 5 scenarios of it in the campaign. But the problem we had is he would not ever let me convince him to try to escape. Like, he wanted to push the operators to their limit every time, so they kept dying. Like, so I was like, we were like 5 scenarios in, and we had destroyed like 2 or 3 ships, and every operator had died. And so
oh
we,
no.
so we restarted the campaign. And my daughter, I just asked her like in passing, hey, do you want to play with us? And she's like, yeah, I'll play. And yeah, we're on scenario 6 now. They've done extremely well. My son gets it. He definitely gets the gist of the game. But my daughter, who's 10, she knows she could play without me. I mean, she's got it down, right? And
Yeah.
so she's definitely picked it up, and she grokes it for sure.
That's
Yep.
amazing. A lot, Michael, just like side note, a lot of these questions are like super general, and I do want to have some opportunity to talk about specific games and specific designs, like in particular By Stealth and Sea. Like,
Right.
so Michael, when you first encountered this game, you thought the subject was off the wall
Yep.
for a typical war game, and
Yep.
so I just want, because my reaction to it, and David, I'm glad that you're here, so I can tell you personally. My reaction when I first heard that I didn't even know you had designed it, and but there was a game about this subject, was I read about the Italian Frogmen when I was like 10 years old, because my dad was a huge World War II buff, and so I remember like he had a book. That I would just pick up and read at the time, and I'd read about these Italian frogs, so it was like, oh, I'm already familiar with this topic, and it drew me in, So it had kind of like the opposite effect from Michael, who's been into war games since 1949.
Hey.
And,
Back in my day.
so I just want to hear from you, David. Like, if we can like digress specifically into one particular game, like what was your thought process? Like, why did you want to do a focus a game on this subject, which is from a typical war game perspective, like not a usual subject. But I just find it really fascinating.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I will say, generally speaking, if you look at the war games I've designed, they are extremely deep and not very broad in their subject matter. And so what I mean by that is, like, Castle Itter is a singular day event, right? This topic is not something that there's a lot of literature on, right? Especially English language literature, meaning By Stealth and Sea. Um, but it allows me, because it is such a tightly focused topic, to do tons of initial research. And the reason for that, and Michael knows this is true, when you're in war games, if I put out a game about the Battle of the Bulge, it's going to get absolutely ripped apart by the history buffs, right? And I'll
Yeah.
tell you, I'll just be openly, like, totally honest with you. It's super intimidating for me. Like, as a guy who makes war games, I'm like, man, do I really want to make a game about, the Battle of the Bulge or whatever, because everybody and their mother knows way more about it than I do. And so, and personally, I love the research that goes into like the personal level, meaning like the individual humans are represented in a game, right? So that's pretty much, that's pretty consistent with all my war games, or pretty much at what we call the skirmish level, right? Individual people represented. Now, this topic specifically, by Stealth and Sea specifically, is a weird origin story, unlike any of the others, because I was actually approached by a publisher when I was living in the UK to design a game about just one of the missions. One of the missions that had occurred in Gibraltar, and they wanted me to design the game. And so actually, the genesis of the game goes back about 5 years. I designed it. I had called for playtesters. People playtested it, got tons of feedback. I was pretty much done with it. But, and was bad on me, we didn't have a contract. We never put together the contract for it. So when I was done, I went to him and I said, hey, the design's pretty much finished. We need to go ahead and get the contract together. And he wanted to pay me I forget the technical term for it, but basically it's a one-time fee for the game, which is extremely, extremely, extremely unusual. And if any would-be designers, any people that are getting into design ever are approached with a publisher that want to pay you a one-time fee and own the rights to the game instead of a royalty, do not do it. Do not do that thing. And so I was like, no, that's not going to work. I just want a typical royalty like every other, typical contract. And so it wound up just kind of falling through. And so I put the game on the back burner. And then when, I had sort of built up my relationship with DVG, with Dan Verson Games, I was like, well, rather than just do a single mission, why don't we turn this into a campaign game, and we can blow it up and make it, this much, much bigger production. And so in that one specific case, it wasn't a topic that I had come up with myself. It was actually something that was pitched to me by a publisher that got me into it. But when I was just like you, once I started reading about it, I was like, oh man, this is so cool, so interesting. Something I didn't know that much about, and it gave me a chance to really explore it.
I love that, and thank you for sharing that. And also, the fact that you mentioned that it's a campaign game, and I think we talked about this in our review, that I think it works better as a campaign game rather than as a one-shot, even though you are able to play it that way, because you get personally invested in the characters that you place their pictures there, you place their names there, and it reminded me of the game XCOM. If you're familiar with that, because you build your team, and then you draft your troops, and they all already they're real people. They have names, and then you do missions with them, and then you get close to them, and then they level up and they get better, and then all of a sudden, they have a bad mission, they're unlucky, and then you actually can go, and there's a memorial in the game for your fallen troops. And I'm like, that's how your game hit me. It's like, you play a few missions, and you've got this, they've gotten better, and their machines have gotten better, and then you've had some close scrapes together, and then all of a sudden they get captured or they get killed, and then it really hits you on a personal level. And I think that's one of the magic pieces of this design.
Yeah. Well, I'll be honest with you. The thing that I really, really, really wanted to accomplish in the campaign was to give the players the extremely difficult decision about whether or not they do push ahead and try to score points and, get all the benefits of improving your gear and all that, or, escape early and make sure your operators live. And it's like you're saying, there's two reasons, right? One is the sort of emotional, personal element of it, right? Like, their guy's not getting captured or killed. And the other is just from a practical perspective, right? Like, how far am I willing to push this? How far? It's basically a push your luck choice, right?
So let's talk about design a little bit then. So David, you said something about you do a bulge game, people are going to tear it apart. I think they're going to do that regardless. Well, what did these tanks in the man torpedoes, or they could only go this kind of thing. You're going to get people who are nitpicking, and so I wonder what your thoughts are on what the biggest thing board gamers just do not understand about game design or mechanics, and what you think could stand more appreciation by board gamers, if anything.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of things, right? There's a ton of things. I think that a lot of players gamers don't understand the distinction of like what a designer is, what a developer is, what a publisher is, where some of that begins and ends. And I think that, that's fine. And honestly, most gamers probably don't need to know those things. But oftentimes you'll see people conflate the two, right? Like it's not uncommon at all for somebody to ask me about a production thing to a game, and I'm like, well, I have no idea, right? Because I had nothing to do with that. So I think that's one thing, is just that distinction between those different roles in the industry. And the other thing I think that would people might find interesting, certainly if somebody was ever thinking about game design, was the amount of time that I spend doing things that's not designing a game, because I'm a game designer. And so what I mean by that is, I usually wake up about 4 o'clock in the morning, and work on game design until I go to work, which is like start getting ready about 6:30. So that's when I do game design, because I don't like to take time away from the family in the evenings of the weekend and stuff. And so for that period of time, I do things like answering posts on BGG, answering posts on Facebook, checking files to make sure they're good for the printer. It's just tons and tons of stuff that has nothing to do with design work. And so I just think it's, I think everybody kind of just thinks of a game designer as you just go off and you work on some mechanics, and you maybe the theme or whatever. Right now I'm working on a game, ironically, and that's probably why I mentioned earlier, Battle of the Bulge game, though a very small scale game. And I'm pretty much done with the design work of the game right now. So I've transitioned to play testing it and doing some development work. But I'm starting to put together the outline for the companion book I'll write for it, right? Which is nothing but historical text that will, accompany the game. And so it's just a ton of things that are adjacent or tangential to game design, I think, that might surprise people.
So the question that we've written down here is, what are you drawn more towards, simplicity or complexity? Why? And I think I want to add a little, of like context here from my own kind of perspective here. I remember watching, you mentioned Martin Wallace earlier, and he's one of my favorite designers, even though I've only played like 3 or 4 games of his. And I know he's got 4,000 designs over the years. But I remember watching a video of his that he did last year for the Manchester Game Jam. And it was just, it was just him on his backyard, and he, was being asked, like, what are the top 5 things, pieces of advice that you would give to the game designers, like the folks who are going to be participating in this game design contest. And one thing that he just casually tosses off, as he's leaning on his back deck in his house in Australia, I suppose, right, is and I'm not going to do his accent, but but he basically says, he designs, he likes to make very simple designs, and then he goes, not that I don't make complicated games, and he mentions brass and whatever, but that he starts from a philosophy of make the design as simple as possible, and then allow the complexity to flow from the emergent behavior that kind of grows out of just these simple building blocks. And that really struck me, this struck a chord in me, both as a gamer and as somebody who, has dabbled in game design. I'm not a grown up like you. I'm not a published designer like you, but and I just want to know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, yes, that's brilliant advice for sure. This will sound a little bordering on cliche, but I would say that elegant and deep would be what I would strive for with every possible design, right? Like you want the design itself to be an elegant design, and you want the gameplay to be super deep. The closer I can get to that, the better it'll be. Now, I basically live in 2 different worlds when it comes to game design. I live in my war game, really solitaire war game world, and I live in a other thing that's not that, which usually means I'm co-designing it with somebody like Trevor Benjamin, who's my design partner for Undaunted and War Chest, and I've worked with others. In my war game designs, I still try to keep them as elegant or simple, however you want to define that, as possible. Though I allow for more, and I think there's a greater expectation for more what we in the war game world call Chrome rules, right? And so what I mean by that is, well, let's take Castle Itter for an example, right? So it's when I'm doing a war game design like that, I will model the game. I'll identify all the critical components that I want the game to evoke, usually some sort of narrative element that I want to be able to recreate in the game. And I will add those bits to the core game to make sure that you can do that in the game. And so in the case of Castle Itter, there was a guy, a professional tennis player, who escaped from the castle and went and got help. And so that's not anything other. The mechanisms that allow for that has to be unique to him. And so that adds complexity to the game. But I try to build that into the core system as elegantly as I possibly can, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, outside of my war game designs, I would never in a million years do that, right? Like that's sort of antithesis to my philosophy in, say, like a Euro game design or an abstract game design. But I just think it's a different design goal.
David, you talked a little bit about this in this last question here, but I'm kind of curious. But do you design more, would you say, for yourself or for what you think the audience wants? Is there ever any design elements you put in there that you're like, oh, I don't like this at all, but people like it, so I'm going to go ahead and stick it in there? Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Absolutely for myself first and foremost, right? And I'm not designing for money, and if I was, then I wouldn't be able to support my family, obviously, because you don't design games for money. But it's a hobby, and I want it to be a hobby, and that means I should be doing it for my enjoyment, right? Now, having said that, let's say the good examples, right? So there's Undaunted, Normandy, North Africa. We've got another expansion coming out, and we're also working on the fourth game in the series and for the summer of 22. Or War Chest has some expansions, or the Valiant Defense series has multiple volumes. I'm not ever going to put out a product as an expansion or a game in a series that I don't feel advances the series for players, right? I'm not just doing it because, I want to do it to churn it out for the sake of churning it out. There has to be something uniquely new that I'm bringing. And that's actually for both me and the audience. Me, because I don't want to be, bored with the design, but also people deserve to experience something new and interesting, right? And so I have to keep that in mind too while I'm designing it.
Who do you think are the top board game designers right now, and what do you think makes them successful?
Oh, I should be better prepared for this answer. Or for this question. Sorry, for this question.
Like I said.
Yeah, I mean,
if you're not happy with the question, we do have an escalation process. It goes straight to Michael.
Please hold. Your call is very important to us.
I mean, there's like, who do I think is the top game designers right now, and who are my favorite? Let me just tell you who I think is a brilliant game designer, and that's Paolo Mori. Do you guys know him? Do you know his work?
Blitzkrieg, you mentioned earlier.
Yep.
That's one of his pieces. I love that game
one
too.
Of his Ethnos, I think, is a brilliant game. Basically, I mean, I think he's just fantastic, and I think he's underrated. And so I think we talked earlier about simplicity in design or elegance in design. I think he's sort of a master at that. There's so much depth in his gameplay for such simple rule sets typically. And so for me personally, I would say that definitely he's my favorite, maybe not the top board game designer objectively, but certainly one of my favorites.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And, speaking of Blitzkrieg, it's one of those games that, kind of is aligned to some of the principles you expressed earlier, right? It's extremely streamlined. I mean, the whole design goal here was play the entire, World War II, all these different campaigns inside of 20 minutes and still have a thematic experience. And I think he pulls it off brilliantly. The other piece of this that also kind of ties into something we were talking earlier is you mentioned that you're not a fan of like solo modes that are basically a long list of a decision tree. And the thing is that's with the solo mode, which was not designed by Paolo Mori, I don't believe, is a decision tree. And so that was kind of daunting for me at first when I started to play it. But then after a while, it got like to be second nature.
Mhm.
It's only initially when because it's a lot of text in this fairly short rule book about how do you decide what the AI does. But once you go through it a few times, it actually works pretty streamlined. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great game.
So for all the solo players who are interested in Blitzkrieg, so the designer for the solo version of that is David Turksey. And so David is he's actually the person who's designing the solo version for Undaunted and the solo version for Sniper Elite. And I think that the work that David, and I think he's now become sort of synonymous with, maybe he might be the top solo designer of Euro games, and it's generally speaking. I think he does a masterful job of designing solo systems for games that are originally designed multiplayer. I think that he's if not, he's definitely up there if he's not the top.
Especially in the solo board gamers group, if you ever mention that he designed the solo mode, a lot of ears perk up. It's like, yes,
Yeah.
it's like, what, David designed it.
Yep.
So
Yeah, and
that's
rightfully
pretty
so.
cool.
I think he's brilliant. Yep.
Yeah.
David, what are some of the most essential tools that you use when your design process?
Well, I mentioned it briefly, just kind of in passing. The first thing it depends on the type of game. So let's go with my solo games, right? Because I think most people listening to this, obviously for obvious reasons, are going to be more familiar with my solo work. And so almost all of those are war games, and almost all, well, I'll start with usually 6 months to a year of just historic research, right? There's no game design there at all. I'll just compile all the literature, do all the studies, and then I will, as I said before, I'll build out essentially what's a model of the conflict, right? And so you can use whatever modeling software you want. I usually use some just basic flowchart type stuff, but what I'm trying to do there is identify. I'm not modeling the battle per se. What I'm doing is I'm identifying every key element of the battle that I want the game to evoke, right? So players experience the things that I think are the most important, just from the narrative perspective. So for sure, the ability to, like I said, to model that, I think, is critical in the design. For me personally, the thing that I could not live without now is Tabletop Simulator. It's literally the number one tool, because I now do 100% of all my design work through Tabletop Simulator. It speeds up the process for me so much more than doing physical design work. I'm able to iterate through it so much more quickly. And so, pretty much all my design work happens there now.
What do you use? Sorry to interrupt you.
No,
What do you use design-wise as far for visuals? Do you use Photoshop, Illustrator? Just curious.
Photoshop. Yeah.
Okay.
Photoshop
Yep.
for all my, and this gets cumbersome, so I won't go into details, but every
No
different
problem.
relationship I have with a different person goes into some different collaborative software, right? So I use OneNote with some people, Google Docs with some people. And it doesn't really matter, but just whatever you choose for your collaboration, obviously, like I said, it doesn't really make a difference, but just become familiar, with however you're going to partner with your co-designers. There's a lot of good tools out there, so I would just say explore them, see where it works best for you. But yeah, Photoshop for all the visuals, which is, I'm a Mac guy. I love my Macs, but I will say that
I'm sorry.
well, in this world,
Sorry, Martin.
PC is objectively better, because there are some tools that you just can't. You can't use Nandeck. It's pretty often that the integrated deck builder for Tabletop Simulator is Java based, and it'll oftentimes conflict with the latest OS of Mac until they update it. So there's some challenges for us Mac users, but But yeah.
Funny that you should mention that there's no Nandeck version for Mac, but I have been using multi-deck, and if you haven't heard about it, David, then I'm
Ooh.
very, very happy to um,
Ooh, yes.
introduce you to it. It's written by. He's also a board game designer. He's the guy who did one of the Valeria games. I want to say it's Villages of Valeria. What is his name now? I am googling it as we speak. Designer. Um, Rick Holtzgraf is
Wow.
the gentleman's name, and he has designed a software called Multideck, which is a Mac-based version of Nandeck, which actually is, in my opinion, superior to Nandeck in many different ways, and also easier to use, which is kind of like the historical, like why people choose a Mac, because it's easier to use than other tools, etc. So anyway, I have been using that for a couple of years now. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I gotta tell you guys, we should cut this short. I've got some work to do, so I'm off to use multi-deck. I'll see you guys later.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to the solo. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, and it's funny because I don't know. There's been a card game, like a digital card game, on the Mac forever. Like I remember my father-in-law who passed away. He would play this incessantly. It's called Solitaire Till Dawn. And I'm pretty sure that Rick also designed Solitaire Till Dawn in the 90s. So, because if you go to the website, like the URL is like Solitaire Till Dawn /multideck. So I'm like, okay, weird connections from from the past and present for me. But okay, enough of that little side trip there. David, the question here is, how much do your games change from, let's say, the initial idea stage all the way through to the final product? And as a follow-up question, how long does that generally take?
Yeah. So you'll hear designers talk about, are you a theme first designer, mechanics first? And now typically oftentimes they'll just say, well, you're shooting for an experience, et cetera, et cetera. It's all very cliche. I am absolutely a idea first, like theme, like story designer first. And so from the perspective of, I start with whatever that story is going to be before I ever craft the first, integrate the first mechanic. They often don't really change significantly, right? So I'll come up with an idea. I'll usually okay, this is the game. This is sort of my mission statement for the game. And I will start with a very bare bones skeleton, mechanic wise, of how the game is going to play out. And oftentimes it either just doesn't work and I just kind of set it aside, or I move through it incrementally. So very seldom have I had a game that's gone from concept to published that's radically changed. I don't think that's ever been the case, honestly. Now that's very different than some of my design partners who are, hey, I have this really ingenious mechanic idea, work through it. It changes a lot, and then they have this final, whatever that mechanical framework is, and they integrate a theme to it. I think if you start that way, it's much more likely that your initial framework is gonna change more.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I would have thought, what strikes me about your answer is that you seem to be very confident in your designs, which is the exact opposite of me. I remember I was designing a game a couple of years ago for a Board Game Geek solo game design contest, and I had this mechanism in mind for the end game that was kind of like modeled after Battleship, and I thought it was really cool until it hit. What is that saying? The best laid plans only survive until first contact with the enemy. Well, from a game design perspective, I think your best laid plans only survive until first contact with playtesters. And then when people started playtesting this design, it's like, man, this sucks. This doesn't work at all. And I had to really just spend a lot of time, redesigning and refiguring out the last half of my game as a result. So the fact that you say that, it doesn't change much from initial to final product is pretty amazing to me.
Well, again, though, that's only the ones that make it there, right? Many of them die early, never to see the end, right? And so, there's advice that you'll often hear about game design where you want to get it in front of playtesters as early as possible in the design process, because and that is absolutely true, because what your game design always sounds great until you start testing it, right? It's like, oh, this is going to be fantastic. Conceptually, it works marvelously, and then you get it in front of somebody and you're like, no, there's some issues here, and you want to learn that as early as possible.
David, what outside of board gaming influences you most in your design work?
Yeah, it has to be history, right? I mean, it seems like most of my designs now are, they're really influenced by historical accounts, or, just research that I'm doing, for sure. Because even games that are like Undaunted, which many people don't even count as a war game, right? They look at more of as a Euro game with a war theme. Had tons and tons and tons of research that went into each of the scenarios, and so absolutely, I'll be reading a book about some whatever battle or whatever, and that'll spawn ideas for a game. The other thing is, I really don't have a lot of time for other hobbies, right? So between being a dad and a day job, and doing game design work, very little other than just like I said, hanging out with my kids, occasionally watching football, and then reading. And most of what I read is nonfiction, usually history. So definitely, I would say history, especially military history, is by far the biggest influence.
Very good. As long as you're not a Falcons fan, right?
I am a huge, that. Come on.
I know. I seen your post. That's fine.
We're back in the dark years. There was a short period of time where they were at least respectable, and where we've reverted back to our first 30 years of existence.
I'm still waiting for the Texans to get to that point. So
yeah.
Anyway, no football talk, ladies and gentlemen. Go ahead, Mark.
This was sponsored by the NFL. No. What is something, and this something could be a mechanic, a mechanism, a rule, an aesthetic touch that you think is awesome, but is currently underrepresented in board gaming right now?
Yeah. So I will say what I think is, so I get asked a lot about the influences of Euro games in wargaming right now, right? And that's something that some wargamers lament. Some people think it's great. And, there's a definite increase in the number of sort of hybrid Euro wargame or Waros, whatever you want to call them. And so a lot of people ask me, because I kind of straddle those two things, what do I think about the influences of Euro games and wargaming? But I'll tell you, I'll flip that on its head. I think there is an extremely underappreciated wargame mechanism, the chit pull mechanism, which I adore. And I think that it could be, I would like to see more chit pull integrated into more Euro games, right? And so I think it's a fantastic mechanism. I think you can do all sorts of really interesting things with it. And I think that it does an amazing job of combining two critical elements of a game, that being turn sequencing and action selection in a single sort of integrated thing, right? Concept. So I would say it's certainly not underrepresented in wargaming, but I think it's absolutely underrepresented outside of wargaming.
It's fascinating that you should mention that, because a few episodes ago we reviewed a game called Warp's Edge. I don't know if you've had a chance to play that one, David, but I've come to know it. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I haven't played it. I listened to your guys' review. I thought it sounded interesting. I was sort of on the fence, right? Because you guys were mixed between the two of you. You're mixed in your review. But then I thought, man, can I enter to win a game copy? I shouldn't enter to win on a podcast I'm going to be on. So I recused myself.
That's a good question. Thank you for taking the righteous path. I mentioned it because like the main mechanism of that game, as stated in Board Game Geek, and as like I've come to know people talk about it, is a bag builder, which turned out to be the first bag builder that I ever played. And then, as you referenced, I really enjoyed it. And then, but when Michael was talking about it on the pod, he referred to it as a chit pull mechanism, and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I mean that makes sense, but that didn't enter my head, and so I just want to kind of follow up here and say, or ask, when you say chit pull mechanism, is that also like synonymous with a bag builder, or?
Well, I mean, for sure, right? Like everything's blurred, right? Like I think they're very similar. I think you could do very similar things. I'll give you what my distinction between the two would be, and let you kind of make of that what you will. So when I think of a bag builder, which is obviously derived from deck building and pool building, right? I'm as a player controlling my own thing. So like, have you ever played Orleans? Or do
No,
you
I'm
know it?
not.
Okay.
No.
All right. So it was one of the first bag builders, but basically you're managing whatever you're putting in the bag, and it's not influenced directly by your opponent, right? Just like a deck builder, right? A Dominion or whatever. You're building your own deck. You modify it however you want. You control the input randomness that goes in the deck and whatever you get on the backside. When I think of chit pull, at least the way I generally think of it, you're putting your components in a common bag, right? And so you can still do a lot of manipulation like you do in deck building or bag building, but I think more of in terms of doing really interesting things like the sequencing of actions between the two players isn't necessarily symmetric like it would be in a bag builder, where you pull a thing out of your bag and I pull a thing out of mine. What do you think about that, Michael? That distinction? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, when I think of chit pull, I think of initiative type games, where you just throw them in there and then you draw, and I think that's great for solo play.
Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. I think that I mean, this is a huge oversimplification, but I would say that a chip pull system in a two-player game is about as solitaire friendly as you could possibly have without a game not being solitaire, right?
Right. Agreed. Yep. Absolutely.
Well, so there should be more chit pull games out there. Are you listening, designers?
So, David, how would you describe a game design to a non-gamer? For example, if somebody asks you what you do for a living, they're not board gamers, what do you say? I know you said you have a day job, but this is kind of on the side. How do you describe that to somebody?
Yeah. I think we're in a fortunate time now where most people are familiar with at least Catan or Ticket to Ride, right? So you don't have to go through the whole defining like what even is a modern board game. Now, I was recently on a conversation with I was talking to a guy who I have to talk to periodically for the job I do, and it's like a background investigation kind of thing, and he was asking me about things that I was doing outside of work. And I mentioned, I have to report that, I'm a game designer, so I get money from places other than my normal job. And he was like, oh, what does that mean? What do you do? And I tried to describe it, and he finally was like, oh, you mean like games like Catan? I was like, okay, thank God. Yes, that's that thing right there. So it is very difficult. Even with that, you don't want to get into like, well, yeah, it's kind of like Catan, but slightly different. So I don't know. I think you just try to find the thing that the person is most familiar with, and just that find that common ground that they understand, because it is a very difficult thing, right? If they have no grounding whatsoever in hobby board games,
right? Yeah, and it's funny too how particular wargamers are. If you go to any given wargaming group on Facebook and drop a line like, "Hey, Memoir 44 is my favorite wargame. What's yours?" and you're gonna just start a storm.
Yeah, right.
Or asking what a war game is,
right.
It's still you're gonna get 200,000 different answers. It's really funny how that works, but it's good too, because as long as people don't attack each other over it, I think it's fine to have all those different opinions about what a game is or is not, as well as what a war game is or is not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I was asked. It's funny you should say that. I was asked to appear on a World War II history YouTube channel next month. And cool. The guy who was asking me to appear there, he just we had a mutual contact, and they were like, "Oh, you should talk to this guy." And so he reached out to me and was like, oh, okay, I want to have a episode about wargaming and using it to learn history of World War II. And so I asked you on, I was like, oh, that's great. You should also ask on somebody from the miniatures wargaming world, right? Because that's a very different world. And he had no idea that like those are different things, but they are very different things, right?
Yep.
If you're in that hobby, it's almost a completely different hobby, right?
Yes. Like where you like to paint and assemble minis.
We're gonna
Shudder.
You had to bring that up again.
I am so sorry. I did not mean to.
Did you say that somebody would actually like to paint and assemble minis? Because
yeah, of course. And that Facebook group for that particular game is just all kinds of intimidating. Oh, look what I did with my Marine model. Look what I did with the aliens. Ugh, I don't even know how to freaking paint a model. I've never done it. I mean, well, I've done it when I was a kid. I've just, how do I even start? I don't have time for that.
I tell you, I'm super, super lucky. Somehow I found out there was a guy he's a former Marine, lives close to me, separated recently, and started a business doing painting minis, right? And so my son and I got into Star Wars Legion, and I wouldn't have gotten into it except I knew that guy was close by. And so he's painted up all of our miniatures for us, and I absolutely love it. I love, love, love having them. I wouldn't have done it myself. So, yeah.
Right. I understand.
Yeah.
Nice.
That brings up an interesting question that's not here on our outline, so I'm just going to go rogue again. David, have you ever designed a game with miniatures?
Yes. Well, kind of. So the very first game I told you guys about, that ultimately became what's called For What Remains, which is a DVG sort of sci-fi war game. Originally, I conceived of that as having minis. Like I thought it would be this mashup between minis and like a minis board game, right? Now, what's interesting is when I reworked it with sort of the more modern, because when I first started designing it, like I said before, I didn't really know about board games at all. And so obviously my design sensibilities over the last 15 years have changed quite a bit. And so when I reworked it to be a DVG game, I reworked it with a lot of I think are interesting modern war game concepts. So like I integrated things like step loss counters, right? Things that are very wargamey. Like again, it has a chip pull, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm tangenting a little bit, but that's just to say that it came from originally being a minis game to what it is. But actually, next year I'll have two games come out that are, one game has minis and one is a minis game. So the game that has minis is Sniper Elite, which is a video game that we're turning into a board game. I wouldn't call it a minis game, right? It just happened to have minis in it. But then there's a game called Dire Alliance, which shares a lot of gameplay DNA with Undaunted and War Chest. As a matter of fact, the company that's publishing it, Blacklist, specifically came to us because they liked Undaunted so much. And so it's that sort of skirmish level, deck building driven miniature skirmish game.
So this kind of very nicely segues into the next question here, and you've already talked. So the next question is, what game projects are you working on now? Unannounced titles or anything like that? And you just mentioned a couple. And before I stop asking this question, I just want to say that I am very excited about Sniper Elite. Not so much because I've not actually played the video game it's based on, but I think that I love sniper flicks and sniper books, even bad ones. And like the what's his face, the 2007 Mark Wahlberg movie Sniper. As tacky as it is one of my favorite movies of all time. And I generally watch it several times a year, which is so strange to me to kind of acknowledge publicly on this podcast. But anyway, so I don't think there are enough sniper games, is what I'm trying to say. So for this game to be coming out and to just kind of like have that cat and mouse, kind of feel going on, I'm very super excited about. I've also taken a look at Dire Alliance Horror on Tabletop Simulator, and it looks super interesting. So yeah, just like just let us know what else you're working on and what our listeners should be watching out for.
Yeah. So one thing real quick about Sniper Elite is, I think it was in your last episode, you guys were briefly talking about V Commandos, and you were saying that you like that sort of like Metal Gear Solid almost feel, right? Or you were saying you like that kind of game, I think, right?
Oh yeah.
Yep.
So a couple of things about Sniper Elite. So it's a hidden movement game, right? At its core, it's a one versus, one or more hidden movement game. And so I designed it with a buddy of mine, Roger Tankersley. It's our first work together because he loves hidden movement game. He's played them all, and he's play tested a bunch of stuff for me. So it was a natural partnership. But one of the games that most influenced Sniper Elite was probably a game called Spectre Ops. Have you guys played that?
I've heard of it. I haven't played it.
Okay.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, so it's a fantastic hidden movement game. Well, anyway, the designer for it, Emerson Matsushi, was going to design a Metal Gear Solid board game, but the company that he was designing it with just lost that license. So he's looking for a publisher now, which is super unfortunate. But it was just a long way to say that hopefully this Sniper Elite design, because of those sort of hidden role or hidden movement idea, concept or whatever, hopefully you'll dig that. And I think that David Turksey's done a good job with the solo game of trying to simulate that feel you get of a hidden movement game with just a solo experience. So hopefully that'll work out.
I'm very excited for that one.
Yeah, I mean, as far as other stuff, so War Chest has a new expansion coming out March. So, I guess next month. It's going to add some new units too. So if people know War Chest, it'll just add more units and a new mechanism. So that'll be good for fans of the game. We already talked about this really briefly, but Undaunted Reinforcements will have an expansion come out this summer. It adds a solo mode, or like an official solo mode from David Turksey and David Digby. That solo mode's amazing because it allows you to play either side for Normandy, either as the U.S. or the Germans. It allows you to play either side from North Africa as the British or the Italians, and it allows you to play all the new scenarios. So just that one expansion gives you solo play for something like, I don't know, like 30 some scenarios between the games. So that's really cool. And then the other thing it does, and this is nice because I love team play, is it allows you to play 4 players as teams, 2 teams. So that's cool.
That is pretty cool. I know, Martin, you said you have Normandy, right?
I do have Normandy, and I was we were chatting with David yesterday or on Facebook, and I was like, and I'm gonna cram it before the recording of the podcast, and I didn't get to do it. I'm so sorry about that. I don't know what it is because it's got deck building in it, and I'm a huge deck building fan, and I was very, very excited when I bought it, but I'm like, just never got to the table, and I really, really want to do it. So
I have North Africa myself, and I like it a lot. I played a solo variant based on I think the channel name is One Man and His Meeple. I forget his name offhand, but he did a kind of demo a solo mode for it, and I liked it a lot. So because Martin has Normandy, and because hold on one second. Okay, Avast does not need to restart my computer right now. Go away. Sorry. Let's try that again. It just popped up right in the middle of my screen. Since Martin has Normandy and I have North Africa, I think we'd both love to get a copy of Reinforcements if we could, because I think the audience would love to hear about that. That would be pretty cool.
Oh, yeah, that would be awesome.
Show.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be awesome for you to get Reinforcements and you to each play, on Normandy and North Africa and compare the experience. That'd be cool for sure.
Totally.
Yeah.
All right. So your next, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, your next item coming out, I believe, is Soldiers. When is that releasing?
Yeah, so it is. I think they just sent the files to the printer, so I would think probably in about 3 or 4 months, right? So people don't hold me to that, but like that would be like June-ish, right? Yeah, I would think June-ish would be safe to say.
2021. Okay.
Yep, that's right.
Just in case somebody's listening next year, you never know.
Yeah, right. Yep.
All right. And the next Valiant defense is Battle of Lanzareth. Is that pronounced
Yep,
correctly?
that's right.
What do you think of that to be later in this year, 2021?
So I think realistically, because right now I'm juggling three major projects. One is Battle of Landsworth Ridge, which is basically it's to the next in the, like you said, the Valiant Defense series. So following up Pavlov's House and Castle Litter, Soldiers in Postman's Uniform. So I'm kind of my own. I set my own schedule to that one, and I don't have it's with DVG, and they basically say, hey, when you're done with it, you're done. Um, I'm working on the next title in the Undaunted series. I can't talk about it, but that's summer of 22, and that one
Cool.
is what consumes my entire life, basically. It is a massive, massive project, and it's going to be. I will say, I can honestly say it's going to be pretty amazing. I think it's by far the most difficult, most challenging thing I've worked on, and it's consuming my life. And then I've got another sort of I would define it as like a narrative war game that I'm working on. That's also a co-design. But to answer your question, Battle of Landsworth Ridge, I want to probably try to get it on Kickstarter around December, because I think it would be cool to sync it up with the anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. I think that's a realistic time frame.
Cool. Very good. All right. Thank you.
I know
Martin,
that I know that was technically the last question in our outline, but would it be okay if I ask a couple more?
I don't see why not. I mean, we're at 113 right now, but that's par for the course for us. So that's
This is
perfectly
actually
fine. I'm fine with that.
shorter episode so far. No.
Go right ahead.
So a couple of things, kind of strike me about what you've shared in this kind of interview that you've done with us, David. Thank you. So I really resonate with the idea that you said that you are a theme first or a story first kind of designer. And also kind of connecting that to my personal experience of, the subject of By Stealth and Sea, which is kind of like an off the wall. And if I think about, I'm not a war gamer, but I did grow up reading my dad's World War II books primarily, because he was a World War II buff. Because he, was a teenager during the war and the occupation of the Philippines by the Japanese. So I would grow up and he would tell me stories about like how he would have to walk home from school and then pass by a Japanese sentry post and then have to bow to them, konbanwa, haikison, and all this stuff. And that was kind of like anyway. So this is kind of a long-winded way of saying, theme first is fascinating to me, and I think ultimately those are the kind of stories. My dad's books that interested me the most were the ones that were a little bit off the beaten path. So not these like, kind of dry historical retellings of grand battles or whatever, but like the smaller stories. I remember like one of my favorites was this small book of World War I flying aces, and it was called Wings of Mystery, and it just told the stories of. It wasn't just World War I flying aces. It was all these like aircraft and like military missions that just disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and they were never seen again. But there were these tantalizing clues, and those are the things that kind of like resonate with me. And I wonder how you feel about like when you think about the stories and you think about like your interest in the war games, are you more drawn toward like the super like hardcore historical tomes, or are you drawn more toward like these like more kind of like off the wall human interest type things? I don't know if that makes any sense at all.
No, absolutely, yeah, for sure, it's the latter, right? Like I mentioned this before, if you look at the consistent thing about almost all my designs, they're all at the personal scale, and it's because I think it's not even really theme first, it's story first, right? And it's much easier to craft a story about something that's personal and at the individual level, and evoke like an emotional response from a player than it is,
Right.
a strategic level story. Like you might enjoy the game, it even might even be tense, but it's not going to reach the same emotional level that a a game at that smaller scale will.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the last thing that I'll ask you is, when I first started to become familiar with your work, it just seemed to me that, kind of like my read was, oh, okay, you're primarily a war game designer who's done some stuff that seems that you want to cross over into kind of a wider audience. And I want to ask you, I, I might not be the only person to have that kind of perception. I think that, that's more nuanced now, but I want to ask you, what do you think? Like, if people kind of like would, kind of do a quick analysis of where you stand in the board gaming kind of industry as a designer, and with your catalog of your body of work, is that a fair assessment, or kind of like in your head, you're just like, I design whatever I want, and some of them happen to be war games, some of them happen to not be. So I want to see where it is at with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair question for sure, and I think it's a fair observation. I would say that if you look at sort of chronologically what I designed that's been released, if you look earlier, it's less war games, right? So the first few games I designed, one was called Armageddon, and it was sort of like post-apocalyptic themed Euro. A little game called Orc Olympics, which was a light drafting game, super like comedic looking. So early on, I was like quote unquote finding myself, if you will, right? Because I didn't really know what kind of games I wanted to design. I just knew I wanted to design games. Undaunted is the game. So it was one of the earliest designs. It started in 2013, 14, when I first started working on it. It was the first game that I worked on that had any sort of war theme design, but it's not the game that got me just into war gaming. It's the game that got me into military history, because before that, I didn't really care, right? And so I was moving at the time from the US to the UK. I had designed this game that ostensibly was about platoon level combat. I didn't know the setting for it. And so I traveled to Normandy, and I visited Omaha Beach, which is where my grandfather's unit landed, right, for D-Day. And at that point, I decided, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to set this game. I'm going to follow my grandfather's unit through Normandy. And that's what the game is going to be based on, his unit. And it's going to tell all the stories for all the places he went. And that launched me, like I said, not just into an interest in wargaming, but an interest in military history. And so there's this sort of natural organic evolution that you'll see in my designs, where I stopped really designing other things for the most part, and I really started concentrating on more like war games and military themed games, with the exception of when I do co-designs. And that's because usually what that means is one of my co-design partners comes to me and they're like, hey, I want to work on this. Do you want to work on it with me? And I'll say, yeah, that's cool. So you probably won't ever see another David Thompson only design that's not a war game. It would just be co-designs that I do.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, David Thompson, for this amazing, wide-ranging, and very insightful interview. And Michael, are we transitioning to the next bit here, number 6 in the outline?
The next bit. Yes, we are. So we have a very special announcement to make here. It seems that we have contest winners for our Warp's Edge giveaway, which we announced in episode 75. And we'd like to announce those winners. We're giving away, of course, 2 copies of Warp's Edge. So we do have our winners. They've already been contacted, but we wanted to announce it here on the podcast to those lucky winners. One receives a retail copy of Warp's Edge, and the other will receive the Kickstarter copy of Warp's Edge. And I want to give a big thanks to Stone Valley Games for supplying that retail copy of the game for the giveaway, and for taking care of shipping costs anywhere in the world as well. Thank you, Stone Valley Games. So the winners are, for the retail copy of Warp's Edge, Todd Graham from North Carolina, and the Kickstarter copy of Warp's Edge goes to Miguel Lourenco from Portugal. So congratulations, folks. Your copies will be out soon. Woohoo! Yay! First ever giveaway by us. I don't know if Brandon and Carter ever did that or not.
I'm sure they did. But this begs the question now, what's our next giveaway?
Well, we do have something in the works, actually, but do we even want to talk about it?
I think it's enough.
No, I'm curious. Do you think that's enough?
I think it's enough for our audience to know that this is the first, but will not be the last giveaway of this iteration of the Solosaurus podcast. So stay tuned.
Yes, we do have something planned, and we will plan on continuing to do that. So yes. So David, again, thank you so much for joining us here today, and thank you all for listening. I'm Michael Eckenfels.
And I'm Martin Gonzalez.
Yeah, and I was David Thompson. Thanks for having me, guys. This has been great.
It has been great to have you.
This was episode 75 of the Solo Sword podcast. It's been fantastic having you. It's a great conversation. Don't forget, guys, we're a part of the Dice Tower Network. For even more Solosaurus, join us on our post-show discussions, and other shenanigans as well on Facebook at facebook.com/Solosaurus. Follow us on Instagram at Solosaurus Podcast, or shoot us an email at solosauruspodcast@gmail.com.
We are also on Board Game Geek, and you will find us under the gaming-related forum, podcasts and blogs, Solosaurus. Or you know what? Just go to your favorite search engine and search for Solosaurus BGG. It's probably faster to find us that way. And as always, if you would like to show your support and love for the Solosaurus podcast, you can do that on Board Game Geek with your very own shiny micro badge. I just polished my Solosaurus micro badge this morning. Now it's even shinier. So just reach out to me on Board Game Geek. My handle is Dr. Henry Armitage. That's Dr. Henry Armitage. And I will spot you the Geek Gold so that you too can have your very own Solosaurus micro badge.
And thanks again to Stone Valley Games for being our sponsor. As always, if there's any particular games you would like us to look at for this podcast, please send us an email, or better, drop us a message on Facebook. Thank you for listening.